I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. New Caledonia is a French territory comprising dozens of islands in the South Pacific. It possesses 25% of the world's nickel resources, which is a mineral critical in the development of weaponry. Several referenda on full independence from France have been held in the territory, but none so far have passed. In recent years, China has paid growing attention to the region, and New Caledonia is one of its targets of interest. A new report published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, known as ASPI, titled When China Knocks at the Door of New Caledonia, explains China's interests, intentions, and activities in New Caledonia. It calls for greater attention to the territory and makes recommendations for the United States and other regional actors to address growing Chinese interference. To discuss Beijing's approach to New Caledonia, I'm thrilled to be joined today by the report's author, Marrie Brady, and she is Professor of Political Science at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Marrie specializes in Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy, polar politics, China-Pacific politics, and New Zealand foreign policy. And thank you so much for being with us today, Marrie.
Kia ora. Thank you, Bonnie. It's really great to talk with you again.
So let's start. Maybe you can just, for those of us who are relatively unfamiliar with New Caledonia, can you briefly give us some background? What's the context that we need to understand before we dive into China's role and interests in New Caledonia?
Well, New Caledonia is formerly part of France's Outre-mer. It's a territory, sui generis. It's called a unique status that's part of France, but it's on an agreed transition towards greater autonomy and potentially independence, depending on the outcome of referendums that, as you mentioned, have been held, and then past the referendums, further negotiations. But in the last 4 months, New Caledonia has been going through a very difficult phase. There have been violent protests and looting and riots in protest against the Macron government, which pushed through a referendum through the parliament, and that was going to increase voting rights at the local level. And the independence movement in New Caledonia was very strongly opposed to that. And so New Caledonia is at a crisis point at the moment, and it's even harder than it ever was to resolve the future status of New Caledonia. And just one more thing I'd like to say actually about New Caledonia that many people may not have heard of is that New Caledonia was really critical to the defense of the Pacific in World War II. It is in a very strategic location. It was an important base for the US forces in World War II. About 1 million US personnel passed through New Caledonia in World War II, and about 15,000 New Zealand troops were stationed there, as well as quite a few Australians, and it was their forward base to push back Japan in the war. It lies along strategic sea lines of communication and air routes. So the future of New Caledonia is crucial to the security of the Pacific today.
Yeah, those are really great points. So let's bring into the conversation China's interests and role. How long has it been involved in New Caledonia is what you're seeing, what you describe in your report, which we'll get into in greater detail in a minute. Is it relatively new? What's the sort of history of China's involvement in New Caledonia?
Well, China's interests across the whole of the Pacific have been a hot topic for about 20 years now. And I started researching the question, about 20 years ago when people were starting to talk about it and look at it. And when I looked at the situation in New Caledonia, I found that there was a lot of speculation, but very little evidence. And I thought it would be important to really go deep and see what indication there is of China's interest and involvement in New Caledonia. So I've been working on this paper for 8 years. And what I found was that China has a surprising range of interest in and engagement with New Caledonia. And one of the most telling things I found was a report assessment from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, a Chinese Foreign Ministry think tank, which was talking about the strategic importance of New Caledonia and the post, if New Caledonia became independent, the situation after that, and whichever great power would dominate in New Caledonia. And this was published back in 1988, I think. China has maintained links with the independence movement, it has supported it financially at times, and New Caledonia is included in the Belt and Road Initiative in Chinese documents, even though New Caledonia hasn't signed any agreements, and nor has France on the Belt and Road. New Caledonia does have some limited autonomy on some foreign affairs matters. So what I found is that that there were lots of points of contact from China, and much along the same lines of the pattern that I have identified in my earlier research, where I was assessing China's foreign interference in countries like New Zealand, Albania, Japan, and other states. And we see a recognizable pattern, and that's the similar pattern in New Caledonia, targeting elites, targeting the Chinese community, trying to influence and shape the information discourse, and forms of economic dependence that can also bind the territory to China.
You talk about in the report the Chinese Communist Party's International United Front work. For many years, China's United Front work was mostly thought of as targeted at overseas ethnic Chinese communities. But that has really expanded. So, can you talk a little bit about what the International United Front looks like and how this is manifested in New Caledonia?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bonnie. A lot of people are paying attention to the CCP United Front work these days, 同江工作 in Chinese. I've been researching it since I first started my graduate research. And it's not new, 国际统战, International United Front. It's a part of the CCP's approach to managing foreigners. So they have these, as Ken Lieberthal was one of the scholars who sort of detailed this quite well, about these I call them policy groupings on different areas. So in Chinese, the word is shitong. So there's the propaganda and thought work, shitong, or policy grouping, basically the public sphere. There's the foreign affairs, shitong. So all things to do with foreigners, the 外事系统. And that was the subject of my doctoral thesis and my second book. And what I found in my research on the 外事系统, the foreign affairs system, is you would find the words 国际统战, International United Front, used interchangeably with 外事. When I started my doctoral research, I had a lot of pushback from established scholars of Chinese foreign policy who said to me, this is not foreign policy, this is not foreign affairs, and they dismissed it. And what I have learned to argue over the years, to understand, is that Western political science and international relations has a particular set of framing for understanding what is foreign affairs. We think it's state to state, and a set of theories. But the Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist political party, and the Leninist part is really important. And the United Front concept is an absolute key aspect to Leninism. In fact, I think if you want to understand Chinese foreign policy, you need to grasp United Front concept about these tactical temporary alliances. And each time it's necessary in each era to understand China, or the Soviet Union back in the day, or Vietnam and other communist Marxist-Leninist parties, you need to understand who, in their eyes, is the chief enemy. So in World War II, the chief enemy or main threat was Japan. But since the breakup of the Soviet Union for China, the chief enemy, the main threat, is the United States. So while the United Front work is used within the Chinese diaspora community and also in China against or to manage Tibetans and religious groups and so on, that's one small aspect to it. The overarching concept is the worldview that the CCP has about the challenges it faces. And the key one is externally, who is the chief threat? And then policies flow from that. So when it comes to international relations and United Front work, say in the Pacific, New Zealand's a good example. New Zealand's a Five Eyes member state, and New Zealand has experienced a lot of the CCP's United Front work, in other words, political interference. And one of the main reasons, amongst many, is that New Zealand's a Five Eyes partner, and breaking New Zealand away from that alliance will weaken the US and isolate New Zealand. So this is I think in our field of Chinese politics, there has been, people have not focused so much on these aspects of the party, and there's really been a handful of scholars who are looking at it.
What's going on specifically in New Caledonia? What are the manifestations of this policy? Where do you see interference activities by China today?
Well, what I found was over decades targeting political elites, and one of the both engagement with and support, covert support of the independence movement, as well as what's been very interesting about United Front work in the present era is a lot of it's been quite public because our governments haven't understood the context. So for a while, from 2016 to 18, the French government encouraged New Caledonia to engage more with China. And the means for that engagement was with official permission from France via the New Caledonia China Friendship Association, which is a front organization that is partnered with and guided by the Chinese Association for Friendship, Youxie in Chinese, the People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which is a key United Front organization, which is under the leadership of the International Liaison Department of the CCP, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and plus Jingqie is its other leading body. Jingqie is the Chinese People's Consultative Committee. So the French government had authorized a China Front organization to represent New Caledonia in its interactions with China. Now that policy's changed now, but the interesting thing about New Caledonia is there is that autonomy within the system. So France has its policies, but the government of New Caledonia, which has until recently been led by a pro-independence coalition. It's just changed in the last couple of weeks. They have been continuing aspects of that policy from 2016 to 2018, but much more, I would simply say, on a less public way than before. And then there've been the economic, it's really significant is the big change economically in the relations with China and New Caledonia, because France, as it does where I'm here at the moment in French Polynesia, is extremely vigilant about the risk of China to French interests and sovereignty. And they do have a voice on mineral rights and exports in New Caledonia. They're on the Mining Council there. And so for quite a long time, there was quite a limit on exports of New Caledonian nickel to China. But that all changed about 10 years ago. So they went from about 11% exports of nickel to China to a year ago up to 63%. It's come down again because one of the provinces of New Caledonia, where there has more autonomy, have decided to reduce their relations with China because of their political concerns. And now it's down to zero because of the riots. But that kind of economic dependency we've seen elsewhere in the Pacific. It influences the politics too, because politicians are afraid to offend their main market. That's actually the dominant narrative in New Zealand, and we don't have anywhere near the level of dependence on China trade that New Caledonia has had for the last 10 years. So that's another factor. And France is talking about wanting, nickel's a strategic resource and wanting access for France and Europe for that nickel, but it's so slow, the change in economic policies in Europe to become more self-sufficient and deal with these kind of vulnerabilities. And meanwhile, China is already there.
You mentioned earlier that there are Belt and Road projects in New Caledonia. Have there been loans that, as we have seen in some of the recipient countries, that have led to a great deal of debt? Is that also a problem? And do you know offhand what some of the major projects have been under the Belt and Road and what their consequences have been? In some places, of course, we've seen the Chinese bring in their own labor. We've seen negative environmental impact. Of course, there's been a wide range of impacts of Belt and Road projects, and some of them have been more successful than others. So what does it look like in New Caledonia?
Well, what it looks like in New Caledonia, it's really important about talking about Belt and Road in China is to separate what China says is happening and then what's happening on the ground. Because there's a lot of propaganda about it on the Chinese side that doesn't match the reality. And it can be quite surprising for countries to discover how China's talking about them in Belt and Road. For example, China talks about further deepening New Zealand's involvement in Belt and Road. And New Zealand has formally said, we're not talking to you anymore about Belt and Road. They had agreement to discuss. But they're still sending delegations to New Zealand about that. So for New Caledonia, amongst the interviews that I did, there were people from the New Caledonia China Friendship Society who told me they were surprised in one of their early visits to China to be included in this conference, which was specifically about how to involve New Caledonia in the Belt and Road. And they said there were about 50 Chinese scholars there who presented papers on how China was going to involve New Caledonia in Belt and Road. And one of the main areas was going to be aquaculture, because aquaculture is less sensitive for France, and there would be more ability to develop things. Well, that hasn't happened yet. Of course, the pandemic was slowed everything down. These things were starting to get into motion from 2018-19, and then comes the pandemic, so everything stops for a while. Another project that was talked about with New Caledonia and Belt and Road was the idea of a Pacific hub of airports linked back to China, that the Solomon Islands airfield, formerly called Henderson Airfield, which was built by Japan and then the US in World War II and was fought over, many lives lost, was going to be the Pacific hub with direct flights up to China, and that New Caledonia would have an airport, a connecting airport from the Loyalty Islands, which is the third province of New Caledonia, as part of that. Well, the Loyalty Islands built that airport with funding from France, built their international airport, but they've only had one international flight so far, and it was to Vanuatu. So the story that I found in New Caledonia and China was of many, many efforts on the Chinese side, and then a really interesting pattern of like ping pong, where so resistance when things were sent the way of New Caledonia, and not just from the French, Kanak leaders in some situations, and also in leaders within the independence movement who have had experiences, business experience with sort of China, or even earlier experiences, which they weren't happy about. And one of the comments I heard from one of the key figures in the FLNKS, which is the group of political parties that are pro-independence in New Caledonia, Mr. Rokwamitan, he said that New Caledonia did not want to swap one form of dependence for another. And he said, we're not foolish about China. But he also said that doesn't mean France has carte blanche. So the most concerning thing I found really was the economic dependence. And that is something that is going to need further work on diversifying the markets. But also now we have this extraordinary situation of more than 4 months of rioting. There have been thousands of cars have been burnt and houses burnt and buildings burnt, an estimated at least $2.2 billion worth of damage in New Caledonia, the nickel industry to come to a standstill. So who will pay for the rebuild? And because France can't pay for it all. And New Caledonian leaders are already reaching out to Australia for assistance. So that's the next question is, we would not want a situation such as occurred in Tonga after the riots in Nuku'alofa, where Tonga then became dependent on China because of loans that were given to rebuild.
So I assume that at least part of Beijing's strategy is that if New Caledonia were to become independent, that they would want to establish diplomatic ties with New Caledonia. And there's only a handful, I think 3 countries that in the Pacific that still recognize the Republic of China, Taiwan. Do you think that would be the likely outcome? Is there sufficient sort of interest groups, including maybe business, some in New Caledonia, that would want to be aligned with China? Or do they have any relationship with Taiwan?
There was a limited relationship with the Republic of China with the independence movement in the 1980s, but the export markets to Taiwan have grown in the last couple of years to about 15% of New Caledonia nickel exports are going to the Republic of China. But it would be, FLNKS would be talking about establishing an office in, that's the independence group, an office in Beijing. Also, the government of New Caledonia have talked about establishing they can't have an embassy, but an office, a representative office there, or sending somebody from their foreign affairs staff into the French embassy in Beijing. So there have been discussions about putting the relationship on more open and official channels than via the Friendship Society, which has been. That New Caledonia's status cannot be decided overnight, and as a democracy, it would require a collective decision. And that's what the referendum is all about. But in the hypothetical situation that there was an independent Kanaki, then yes, it's obvious. Of course, they would recognize the People's Republic of China. But the question in the Pacific for the former French territories, or the French territories of French Polynesia and New Caledonia, is what kind of relationship would they then have with France? Would it be like the compact states of the North Pacific, in which the US agrees to provide substantial amount of funding in return for them being essentially aligned with the US, or more be like in a relationship in free association, such as New Zealand has with Niue and the Cook Islands, in that they are independent sovereign states, which New Zealand is, with their permission, responsible for their foreign affairs and defence. But they do have more autonomy, and New Zealand is not required to subsidise them, but that does provide substantial aid to them. So the next question is for New Caledonians: who would continue to provide the very good standard of living that they have there at the moment in New Caledonia? Because France provides very, very large subsidies. And one of the proposals from the FLNKS group was that New Caledonia could become a Djibouti of the Pacific. In other words, to be open itself to be a military base for many countries. Could be France, could be Australia, could be China. Now that would really change things in the Pacific. But these are all hypotheticals because at the moment the political status of New Caledonia remains on an agreed transition, but the outcome we don't know.
How does China's relationship with France factor into its approach to New Caledonia?
Yeah, that is a great question, Bonnie, because one of the things in my research that I found that I had to learn and understand is about it wasn't just about what China was doing in New Caledonia, but also how France was thinking about China and the way in which France either uh, was inadvertently facilitating China's increased interference in New Caledonia, or um, not perhaps dealing with China in a way that was contrary to their stated interests. So, and Macron government has talked about this, the geopolitical, uh, as sort of an independence and a balancing role that France plays between China and the United States. The French government, it doesn't like to openly criticize China usually, although it's interesting when Macron has come to French Polynesia and New Caledonia, he's been very, very frank about the risk of China. But in other situations, he's much more conciliatory. And so France's policy appears quite contradictory. And I've often been told by French diplomats that unlike Australia or even New Zealand, France doesn't like to confront China. And one of even though they recognize the risk, and one of the things that I point out in my paper is that France may not like to confront China, but France is the only military power after the United States that has a global military presence. And China's agenda is to push out the US from the Indo-Pacific, particularly East Asia. And France's military assets are in the way of China's agenda. So France may not want to confront China, but China is in effect wanting to have France lessen France's influence and power and presence in the Pacific region because it affects China's agenda. So that's a tension that the French are well aware of, but I think in their public pronouncements and also how they're dealing with China at the highest level, Macron versus Xi Jinping, I don't think they've fully incorporated the understanding from the Chinese side. You have what they think, but what China thinks, how your adversary thinks of you, I think you have to take into account.
So you make recommendations in your paper for how outside powers, and of course, New Zealand being a very important one, Australia another, the United States has been paying more attention to the Pacific, but sometimes rightly so, I think Australia and New Zealand take the lead, but we are coordinating. What are the recommendations that you make for these different outside powers, or also perhaps for France, for the New Caledonia government, to ensure that China's what you refer to as foreign interference activities do not increase and become more problematic for the governance of New Caledonia going forward?
Well, they say that history repeats, but it doesn't rhyme. So, New Caledonia in World War II was really vulnerable, really strategic, but also somewhat isolated. And then very quickly, New Zealand and Australia understood the risk from 1940 on with the German invasion of France that we did have a Vichy government in the Pacific that was part of the Axis powers. And so New Zealand and Australia embraced the peoples of the Francophone Pacific who were the first in the world to support the Free French, and that call of de Gaulle for the French people around the world to stand with him. And so now again, now we have territories, we have countries of the Pacific, not colonial territories as they were in World War II. We need the countries of the Pacific to stand with New Caledonia and better integrate New Caledonia and French Polynesia into the regional government, into with trade as well, because they've been quite isolated due to their status with France. And I think that France has been quite protective and rather jealous of regional integration. I think of Partners of the Blue Pacific. France was initially consulted, but has not yet joined Partners of the Blue Pacific because they're unhappy about how New Caledonia was approached before France was on that topic. So I think allies must just learn to get along, and we have to, and this is the same thing in World War II. They had the same problem. De Gaulle and Roosevelt and Churchill had their disagreements. We have to drop that and get along and understand what the real challenges are. And our governments talk about this. They have publicly said, the behavior of China and Russia is a real threat to the rules-based international order. So we need France to have more of an open mind and be more accommodating and listen a bit more. We need the countries of the Pacific to embrace New Caledonia and support them. And particularly we need economic support. They're going to need help with the rebuild. They're going to need new markets as well.
We've been talking with Professor of Political Science, Marrie Brady, who teaches at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And I want to thank you, Marrie, for all of your great work on the Pacific, on the Arctic, on New Zealand. The government of New Zealand, as you know, just came out with a new threat assessment report, the second one. And I think it reflects a lot of your insights and work that you have done over the years. So congratulations. And I know that your work will be really influential going forward. So thank you again for joining us.
Kia ora, and thank you, Bonnie, for the work that you do also.